It started with my dog sprinting across the yard, barking like he'd spotted a squirrel on a jet ski. I followed him out, only to freeze mid-step as I heard an unmistakable thumping bass echoing across the lake. My dock. My private dock. Not just occupied, completely taken over. A woman in oversized sunglasses stood at the edge, barking orders into a Bluetooth megaphone while inflatable flamingos bobbed in the water and a full-blown DJ booth blasted party music loud enough to make my fishing gear rattle. It wasn't just a party. It was a full-scale invasion. And there, clinking glasses with strangers on my property, was Karen, my neighbor of 3 weeks, toasting to what she called her annual dock celebration. The problem? That dock is legally mine, and she had never asked permission. My jaw locked. And right then, with my blood boiling and my dog still growling at a man trying to tie his jet ski to my ladder, I whispered one sentence to myself. I'm towing the whole circus, while they're still on it. Life on the lake had always been the perfect counterweight to my fast-paced career. Out here I could breathe. My house sat at the far end of the shore, tucked behind a patch of pines and hugged by the gentle lapping of water against the wooden legs of my dock. I'd spent years customizing it, reinforcing it with marine-grade steel, adding solar lanterns, and setting up a bench where I could sit at dawn and fish in peace. It wasn't just a dock. It was my sanctuary, the kind of place that made your heartbeat slow and your shoulders relax. But all of that was shattered the moment Karen moved in 2 lots down. She had arrived in a flurry of noise and entitlement, treating the peaceful lakeside community like her personal HOA kingdom. Within a week, she had taped homemade, noise regulation reminders to people's mailboxes, told the Thompsons to cut down their 80-year-old willow because it made the lake view uneven, and started inviting people over for what she called lakefront vibe sessions. Nobody knew what that meant until she hosted one and blasted music so loud it triggered car alarms from across the lake. I had stayed out of it. I didn't want drama. I just wanted my dock, my dog, and my damn morning coffee. So when I stepped outside that Saturday morning to find neon streamers, tiki torches, and a live band loading gear onto my dock, it took every ounce of self-control not to scream. Instead, I approached calmly. Karen was instructing a group of college-age kids on where to place beer coolers. She had a clipboard in one hand, a frozen margarita in the other, and the air of a self-declared dictator. I cleared my throat. Karen didn't turn around. I tried again. She finally glanced over, eyes hidden behind reflective sunglasses. "Hey," I said, forcing a neutral tone. "What exactly is happening here?" "Oh, I figured you wouldn't mind," she chirped. "I'm hosting my annual dock celebration. Every community needs one." I blinked. "This is my dock." Karen actually laughed. "Oh, sweetie, the lake and docks are community shared. It's part of the local vibe. Everyone agrees." "I don't agree," I said slowly. "And I have the deed that says it's mine." "Deeds schmeeds," she said, sipping her drink. "You can't gatekeep nature. We're all just tenants on Earth." The logic was so broken it physically hurt my brain. But what hurt more was the sight of her guests hammering nails into the side post of my dock to mount a banner that read, "Welcome to Karen's Cove." I took a deep breath and walked back to my house, grabbed my paperwork, and returned. I showed her the official property lines, permits, and even the notarized title from the city clerk's office. She glanced at the paper like it was a receipt from a fast food joint. "My cousin's a paralegal," she said. "I know my rights, and you can't prove I'm damaging anything." I was still processing that statement when 2 of her guests accidentally knocked over one of my mounted fishing pole racks. One guy shouted, "Hey, this cooler smells like bait," and started chucking lures into the lake like confetti. Another tried to plug a karaoke machine into the solar post I'd set up, shorting it out with a bright pop and a puff of smoke. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Karen marched over. "That's illegal. You're not allowed to record people without consent." "Actually," I said, keeping the camera steady, "it's completely legal on my property." "You mean our property," she said with a wink, then strutted back to her party. The cops arrived after my third call. 2 officers, clearly exhausted by the chaos, stood at the edge of my dock and tried to make sense of the situation. I presented them my documents. Karen handed them what looked like a community dock agreement, which turned out to be a Word document with a stock photo of a lake and a generic copyright-free logo. One of the officers sighed. "This is more of a civil issue, sir. You'll have to take it up in small claims. Can you at least make them leave?" "We can't enforce ownership here without a court order," the officer said apologetically. "Sorry." They left 10 minutes later with margarita go-cups gifted by Karen and a small plate of nachos. By late afternoon, there were 40 people on my dock. Loud music thumped so hard that fish were beaching themselves to escape the bass line. My solar lights were ripped off, replaced with string lights powered by a portable generator that someone had dangerously balanced on the dock's edge. The air reeked of barbecue, beer, and cheap perfume. My blood pressure was skyrocketing. My neighbor Todd passed by on his kayak and shouted, "Dude, is that your dock?" I nodded grimly. "Holy hell," he said. "What are you gonna do?" I smiled for the first time that day. "I'm gonna move it." That night, after everyone had passed out on my dock like stranded castaways, I went to my garage. I pulled out my old industrial winch system, the same one I used years ago when I helped haul a sunken barge back to shore. I checked the chain, oiled the motor, and started rigging it to a remote control unit I hadn't used since the 4th of July firework barge project. By midnight, the plan was ready. I tested the engine once, silent and strong. Karen wanted to throw a party on my dock? Then she and her guests could ride it all the way to the other side of the lake. Because the next time the sun rose, they were going for the most unforgettable boat ride of their lives. And none of them even knew it yet. By the time the sun crept over the treetops, casting golden streaks across the lake's glassy surface, I was already out by the shed behind my house, elbow-deep in cables and steel anchors. The smell of motor oil filled the morning air, mixing with the faint stink of last night's beer that still lingered from the dock. My winch rig was humming perfectly now, connected to the floating braces that I'd reinforced just a year ago during the spring storms. Most folks assumed a dock was just some wood planks on stilts, but mine was a floating beast built for durability and, if I ever needed it, for mobility. And today I needed it more than ever. Meanwhile, Karen's hangover parade was only just beginning. From my kitchen window, I could see partygoers emerging like confused raccoons, rubbing their eyes and stretching, a few already cracking open breakfast beers like it was spring break. Karen was sitting in a foldable lounge chair, wrapped in a pink towel like some kind of deranged lake monarch, barking into her phone while pointing at my property. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but her gestures and the way she waved her drink around told me she was either trying to call reinforcements or make brunch reservations for 40 entitled freeloaders. I wasn't worried. I had footage, documents, and a fully legal land deed in my pocket. What I didn't have was time to deal with this circus by the book. And clearly, the book didn't matter to Karen. So it was time for a little lesson in cause and effect. Before launching the plan, I wanted to be absolutely certain I wasn't being reckless. I called a buddy of mine, Lance, who used to be a marine engineer. He owed me a favor from back when I helped him fix up his pontoon, so when I explained the situation, he was more amused than alarmed. I sent him pictures of the dock's rigging, showed him the flotation setup, and walked him through my plan to tow the entire structure, slowly and safely, across the lake to the public marina. He gave me the green light and even suggested adding a second anchor chain in case anyone got the bright idea to jump ship and try to stop the movement. Now, if anyone thought I was the only one Karen had wronged, they'd be mistaken. By late morning, I had 3 neighbors text me offering help. Todd from across the water volunteered his drone to capture aerial footage, saying, and I quote, "This is better than anything on Netflix." Sheila, who lived 2 doors down and had once been screamed at by Karen for walking her dog too close to Karen's imaginary lakefront border, offered to deliver sandwiches to the marina for when the show ended. Even old Mr. Harris, who rarely left his porch swing, shuffled up to my property line and muttered, "'Bout time someone handles her." I knew I'd struck a nerve with the neighborhood. Karen wasn't just an inconvenience. She was a full-blown menace wrapped in faux activism and scented with lavender air freshener. And now she had turned my dock into her own personal yacht club, complete with a tip jar that read, "Support the hostess." I caught a glimpse of it around noon when one of her guests came ashore to relieve himself on a nearby tree. That tip jar was duct-taped to one of my fishing posts, the same post my late father and I had installed together. That was the last straw. I double-checked the winch's locking system, then secured the anchor chains to the dock's west side. I didn't need to detach it fully, just enough to set it drifting under control. Then I quietly positioned my boat on the far end, out of sight. The boat's engine was electric and nearly silent. I rigged it to tug slowly but firmly. The entire setup was simple, elegant, and absolutely legal. The dock was mine, the lake was public, and moving my own property, especially to remove trespassers, was entirely within my rights. I made sure to set up 2 GoPros on my roof and one inside the boat for good measure. Now it was just a waiting game. The party began to ramp up again by mid-afternoon. Karen had apparently ordered more drinks from some local delivery app, because a young man arrived on a jet ski hauling a crate of canned cocktails. She greeted him like royalty, then turned and yelled across the water, "We'll be partying till sunset, folks. Lake law says fun is mandatory." Lake law. She really believed the nonsense she spouted. Or maybe she just didn't care who she hurt, as long as she felt in control. Her guests resumed drinking, playing music, and some even started dancing again. A few laughed and sprayed each other with lake water like this was some exclusive beach resort. They were dancing on a lie. On stolen planks. I took my position in the boat, thumb on the control. With one slow push forward, the dock began to shift. Not fast. Not jerky. Just a subtle lurch like a raft adjusting with the tide. At first, no one noticed. But within a few minutes, the dock was 30 feet from shore. A woman in a floppy hat stumbled over to the edge, then waved toward land and shouted, "Hey! Are we floating?" Karen didn't even look up. "It's a floating dock, sweetie. Relax. We're tethered." But they weren't. The only thing tethered was their fate. 5 more minutes passed and now the entire structure was well into the lake, moving steadily but undeniably toward the opposite bank. The music kept playing, but people were no longer dancing. They were pointing. Some were calling Karen over, asking if this was part of the experience. Karen laughed, a little too loudly, and then stormed toward the edge to check the anchoring lines. Her laughter died the moment she saw the dock's original tie-up point, completely unmoored. Panic set in like a wave. Someone knocked over a drink cooler. A man started yelling at his girlfriend for bringing him to a cult event. One woman grabbed her purse and clutched it like the boat was sinking. Karen, of course, tried to maintain control. "This is fine," she shouted. "This is part of the festival. We're just cruising the lake. It's a celebration." But the guests weren't buying it anymore. One of them pointed to the far end of the lake and shouted, "Why are we heading straight for that dock?" I let the boat idle just as we approached the public marina. The crowd on the dock was now a mixture of hungover confusion and rising hysteria. Karen was on her phone again, yelling at someone, probably the same cousin she claimed was a paralegal. A few of her guests tried to paddle with their hands, while another picked up a kayak paddle that clearly belonged to me and started swinging it at the water in a futile attempt to steer. I turned the motor off completely, letting the momentum carry them the final stretch. Ahead, on the public marina's dock, stood 2 city officials and a woman from the parks department. I had invited them over that morning, armed with video footage and legal documents. I didn't know how this would end legally, but I knew how it would end symbolically. As the dock bumped gently against the marina's edge, one of the officials raised an eyebrow and said, "That's unusual." Another voice from the crowd shouted, "We're being kidnapped." I leaned over the side of my boat and said, just loud enough for Karen to hear, "Relax. Lake law says fun is mandatory." She turned, eyes wide, as her empire drifted right into judgment. The moment the dock thudded against the public marina, it was like watching the gears inside Karen's head jam and grind all at once. For a second, she genuinely seemed to believe this was all just a strange coincidence, that the wind or some natural lake drift had just magically ferried her party across the water. But as she locked eyes with me, standing calmly beside my boat with my hands on my hips, her face twisted into that signature Karen expression. Half outrage, half denial, all delusion. She marched to the front of the crowd, still clutching her phone, her voice screeching over the murmurs of confusion from the guests behind her. "You're going to jail for this," she snapped. "This is trespassing, harassment, destruction of community property, kidnapping, false imprisonment." I raised a hand and cut her off, not because I had any authority over her, but because I was so done listening to her make up laws on the fly. I turned to the 3 officials standing by the dock ramp, 2 from the city's zoning department and 1 from Parks and Recreation, all invited with advance notice, legal copies of my deed, photos of the party's destruction, and several files worth of documentation neatly arranged in a binder I'd labeled Operation Dock Reclaim. "This woman," I said calmly, "illegally hosted a for-profit party on my private dock, damaged my property, and refused to leave when asked multiple times. I moved my dock, to a public location to safely de-escalate the situation and avoid further damage. I have footage of everything." One of the city's zoning officers stepped forward, holding a folder of his own and flipping through a printout. "This matches what we've received via email," he said. "The dock is listed exclusively under your name. The parcel map indicates it's within your boundary, not communal, and not open to public access unless permitted by the owner." Karen's laugh was dry and shrill. "You're kidding, right? He's manipulating the whole thing. He towed us like animals. These are my guests, this is a community gathering. I was doing a public service. I even provided hydration." The woman from Parks and Rec took a slow step forward and pointed toward the cooler tipped on its side, leaking beer onto the plank. "You provided alcohol, not water. Without permits. And there's evidence of commercial activity, including a donation jar and potential ticket sales. That violates multiple city ordinances." Karen's eyes twitched. "It wasn't commercial. It was donation-based. That's different." A loud voice from the back shouted, "She charged us $20 at the door. Said it was for lake maintenance." Another voice followed, "And I paid 10 to use that flamingo float. Where's my change?" People were no longer defending her. The once merry crowd had transformed into a grumbling, disillusioned mob of wet, half-sober guests, now realizing they'd been duped into paying to party on someone else's property. One man stood up and said, "Wait, we weren't on her dock?" Then another woman asked, "Whose house was that behind the trees?" Karen tried to shut them down with a raised hand, shouting that it was all a misunderstanding, that she was just trying to bring joy to the community. Her words were drowned out by the city officer now reading from a violation sheet. Unauthorized use of private property. Vandalism of recreational structures. Public nuisance violation. And depending on how the footage holds up, possible liability for damage to water safety equipment. I stood silently, letting her implode under the weight of her own nonsense. But I wasn't smiling. Not yet. There was still one card left to play, and I had saved it for this moment. Todd's drone had been capturing the tow, circling overhead while beaming a live feed to his phone. I tapped into it and handed the city official my tablet. On the screen, clear as daylight, was a slow, high-resolution shot of the dock's journey across the lake, complete with timestamps, aerial views, and even Karen dancing near the edge yelling, "This is my lake now," as the crowd cheered. The zoning officer watched the footage, then slowly looked up. You orchestrated this entire move legally, peacefully, and with minimal disruption. The fact that you gave them a soft landing at a public dock shows a surprising level of restraint." Karen muttered something about emotional distress, but nobody was listening anymore. Guests began stepping off the dock one by one, some grumbling, others embarrassed. One guy walked by and gave me a sheepish thumbs up, muttering, "Honestly, that was badass." A woman offered me a half-eaten sandwich from her purse as a peace offering. I declined but appreciated the gesture. Karen, however, wasn't done yet. She started filming me with her phone, yelling that she was going to post this online, expose me for manhandling her guests, and have me banned from the lake for life. But before she could get through her second sentence, the Parks and Rec official calmly informed her that she had 72 hours to file an official appeal, and that any threats or slander could be subject to legal consequences. Karen's hands shook as she tried to keep recording, but she fumbled the phone and it slipped into the lake with a splash. Silence followed, then one of her guests actually clapped. The crowd dispersed soon after, with some calling rides, others drifting off on paddleboards, and a few just walking to the parking lot trying to avoid eye contact. I waited until the dock was clear before beginning the slow process of guiding it back home. It took 2 hours, careful maneuvering, and a bit of help from Lance, who arrived just in time to steady the return process. Once back in place, I secured it with double anchors, added reinforced fencing, and finally installed the motion-triggered sprinklers I'd been joking about for years. No one would step onto this dock again without getting soaked or exposed on camera. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I sat at the end of my dock with a cold drink in hand and my dog curled up at my feet. The water was calm again. No shouting, no megaphones, no stolen karaoke mics or glittery banners with fake slogans. Just silence. Real silence. Peace restored. But I knew Karen wasn't done. People like her never vanished quietly. She would try something again, twist the story, spin a new tale. Maybe try to guilt-trip the HOA, maybe threaten legal action again. But this time, the neighborhood had seen it all. The evidence was everywhere. The officials were notified. Her credibility sunk as fast as her phone. For now I had my dock, my dignity, and a little local legend brewing. People around town were already calling it the Great Dock Tow. A few teenagers had even uploaded the drone footage with dramatic music added. Last I checked, it had over 100,000 views. I didn't want fame. I didn't want a fight. I just wanted peace. But if Karen brought war to my dock again, I was more than ready. And next time, I might just float her entire backyard into the woods. The lake had finally returned to its natural rhythm, gentle waves rocking against the dock, as if sighing in relief after the chaos. I had reinforced every board, locked every latch, and added signage so unmistakably clear that even a lost tourist wouldn't mistake it for public access. No one had dared step foot on my dock since the incident, and for a brief window, I allowed myself to believe that Karen had learned her lesson. That maybe, just maybe, the embarrassment of being towed across the lake with a crowd of equally confused guests had knocked some sense into her. But people like Karen don't retreat. They reload. It started the following weekend with a knock on my door. I opened it to find a man in a slightly wrinkled button-up shirt holding a clipboard. He introduced himself as a property surveyor working on behalf of the Lake Community Enforcement Alliance. A name that, as far as I knew, had never existed. He looked nervous, like he knew this was going to be a weird one. I asked who hired him. He fumbled with the pages and then said, "Karen. She's requesting a boundary reassessment for her extended lakefront usage privileges." I nearly laughed. Extended privileges? There's no such thing. He nodded awkwardly. That's what I thought, but she insisted. Said she's invoking a grandfather clause tied to historic lake enjoyment dating back to 1981. That was the moment I realized she wasn't backing off. She was escalating. And this time, she was trying to cloak her absurdity in pseudo-legal jargon, hoping someone would crack under pressure. But I was done playing defense. This wasn't a matter of conflict anymore. It was about principle. She had violated my space, my trust, and frankly, the sanity of the entire lakeside community. If she wanted to go another round, I'd make sure she regretted ever stepping foot near the water again. I politely declined the surveyor's request to enter my property and handed him a copy of the lake zoning map I'd had laminated. I highlighted my parcel, signed off by the county registrar and verified with 2 independent surveyors. He took it with a shrug and muttered something about billing Karen for a wasted visit. That same day, Todd texted me a photo. It showed Karen standing on her own small wooden platform by the water's edge, angrily pointing toward my dock, while speaking to a guy in a yellow vest and holding what looked like a measuring wheel. Her body language was explosive, full of dramatic gestures like she was auditioning for a courtroom reality show. The caption Todd sent said, "She's now claiming your dock casts a psychological shadow on her peace." I should have ignored it. I should have just laughed it off. But the next morning, I found a laminated flyer taped to my mailbox. It had Karen's face on it and a big red banner that read, "Dock tyranny ends now." Below it was a long-winded rant about how my actions had violated the community spirit, how I had endangered her guests, and how she was starting a petition to have my dock relocated permanently to the far east end of the lake. It wasn't just delusional. It was public. Neighbors began calling me, confused and mildly amused. Some asked if it was true that I had installed military-grade tow equipment. Others asked if they were allowed to sign Karen's petition just to write insults in the comment box. One woman, Mrs. Alden, who had lived by the lake for 30 years, called and said, "I've seen raccoons with more social skills than that woman. Keep fighting the good fight." I figured if she wanted a public spectacle, I'd give her one. A legal one. I printed enlarged copies of the zoning documents, property deed, and violation reports from the city. I placed them on a corkboard at the entrance of my property with a polite sign that read, "Dock is private. Entering without permission will result in automatic sprinkler activation and trespassing reports." Below it, I placed a laminated photo of Karen's party drifting across the lake with a comically large arrow pointing to the caption, "Not how community works." That board became something of a tourist attraction. People walking their dogs or kayaking nearby would stop to read it. Some laughed. A few took pictures. One kid asked his dad if that was the real Karen from the drone video. It was working. But Karen wasn't done. 3 days later, just before sunset, I heard a motorized hum approaching from the east. I stepped out and spotted a small raft carrying Karen and 2 teenagers wearing matching t-shirts that read Lake Equity Advocate. They weren't heading to my dock, but toward the shallow section of my shoreline where the fence didn't extend all the way. The moment they hit land, they stepped off the raft, holding yardsticks and what looked like handmade protest signs. I walked calmly to the edge and asked what they were doing. Karen replied without missing a beat. "Conducting a peaceful demonstration against elitist dock monopolies. You're welcome to join." I blinked. "You're trespassing again." She smiled. "This is not your land. This is nature." I took out my phone and called the sheriff. They were gone by the time the deputy arrived, but I handed over the footage. He sighed and said, "She's persistent. We're compiling a file on her, just so you know. You're not the only one." That gave me an idea. I started contacting other neighbors. Todd, Sheila, Mrs. Alden, even grumpy Mr. Harris. I asked them to send in their complaints officially to the HOA board and city officials. We didn't have a functioning HOA anymore thanks to budget cuts, but we still had influence as property owners. Within a week, we had collected enough signed letters and documented complaints to call for a zoning review hearing. The city approved it. The date was set for 2 weeks later. Karen was notified. She responded by putting up a giant sign in her yard that said, "My dock dreams will not be towed again." Beneath it was a quote she attributed to herself. "I paddle, therefore I protest." It would have been funny if it weren't so annoying. The day of the hearing arrived. It wasn't a courtroom, but a simple community center with folding chairs, a podium, and about 24 curious attendees. Karen showed up wearing a flowing blue robe and holding a folder labeled Karen's legal arsenal. She strutted to the front and began reading a prepared statement about aquatic oppression and spiritual property right. It was long, full of big words used incorrectly, and ended with her dramatically removing her sunglasses and declaring, "I am the lake." When it was my turn, I handed out packets with zoning maps, documented violations, witness statements, and footage of her party invasion and the subsequent tow. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get emotional. I just let the facts speak. The board thanked us and promised to review everything thoroughly. 2 days later, I received the letter. Karen had been formally warned. Any further unauthorized use of property would result in legal action. Her petition had been rejected. She was required to pay restitution for minor damages to my dock. And perhaps most satisfyingly, the city included a clause stating that no communal events may occur on private docks without notarized written consent and a permit signed by the owner. Karen's face was red when I passed her on the road that evening. She didn't say a word, just glared and turned away. But I smiled, knowing the war was nearly over. One more chapter, and I'd be free. The morning air on the lake was crisp and carried a light mist that shimmered like silver on the calm waters. I stepped onto the dock, careful to pause at the wooden railing where I had once asked Karen to leave, and now paused each day to reflect on the storm that had finally passed. The butterflies of dawn hovered over the surface, and the world felt newly quiet. After weeks of chaos, legal hearings, petitions, and public spectacle, the dock belonged to me again in serenity. My dog padded alongside, sniffing at the grass where Karen's protest signs had once been strewn, now long gone with the wind. The tension that had clung to every plank had evaporated overnight when I received the official letter confirming Karen's relocation outside the community. She had sold her house and moved to another town, far from anyone who would tolerate her brand of entitlement, and I allowed myself a small smile at the irony of her new address being nowhere near any body of water. Word of the great dock tow had rippled through social media like a stone across still water. Screenshots, GIFs, and drone footage were shared under hashtags that ranged from #DockDrama to #KarenGetsTowed. I found myself reading comments from strangers cheering me on as the benevolent dock owner who restored order with ingenuity rather than anger. A local blogger even dubbed me the lake's quiet guardian and requested an interview about how to handle property disputes with grace under pressure. I politely declined, knowing that some stories are better left as legend rather than dissected in print. Still, it was flattering to see the community rally around a common-sense approach to boundary right. People reached out to ask if I could help them draft property notices, install their own sprinklers, or rig mini towing systems to keep trespassers at bay. I politely offered advice but reminded them each situation was unique. The last thing I wanted was for my quiet slice of heaven to become a consulting front. Neighbors stopped by occasionally, leaning over the fence to chat. Sheila waved as she paddled by on her kayak, holding a basket of fresh pastries. Todd's drone whirred in the background, capturing footage of sunrise shadows dancing across the water. Mrs. Alden brought over flowers in a mason jar with a note that read "Thank you for keeping our lake peaceful." Even Mr. Harris, seated on his porch, offered a nod and a gruff thumbs up. The camaraderie was a welcome change from the hostility that Karen's antics had fostered. Conversations now centered on fishing limits, canoe maintenance, and sharing tips on birdwatching. It felt like the lake community had reassembled itself around cooperation instead of conflict. I spent the afternoon reinforcing the dock one last time. I replaced any worn boards, tightened every bolt, and tested the motion-activated sprinklers I had installed as a deterrent. They were harmless but effective, spraying a sudden jet of water whenever anything heavier than a raccoon tripped the sensor. I also added a small solar-powered light above the lockbox containing the keypad for authorized guests. It flashed a gentle blue glow at night, signaling that while the dock welcomed friends, it would remain off-limits to gatecrashers. I programmed the keypad to send me a text whenever it was used, just so I could monitor unexpected access attempts. It was unlikely anyone would test it after the legendary tow, but peace of mind was worth the small effort. That evening, under a sky painted with cotton candy clouds, I invited a few close friends over for a low-key gathering. No music, no cameras, just laughter, beer, and a bonfire on the shore. We grilled fish we caught that morning, told stories of past escapades, and toasted to new beginnings. Someone asked if I regretted the tow, if it had been too dramatic. I shook my head and said I had no regrets. It had been necessary to protect what was mine and to show that respect is earned, not assumed. My friends raised their glasses, and we drank to boundaries honored and lessons learned. News of Karen's departure coincided with an uptick in serene lake days. Fishermen whispered about seeing her rowing away on her final morning, dragging a small inflatable duck behind her, as if to mock her own obsession. The rumor ended with her kayak capsizing near her dock, forcing her to wade ashore drenched in embarrassment. The story spread, but I never witnessed it firsthand. Some tales are best left to the imagination. All I knew was that when I passed her old house on the way into town that day, the docks were empty and the yard signs were gone. There was a finality to it that felt satisfying and fair. Life resumed its gentle cadence. Dawn coffee on the dock, afternoons spent napping in a hammock strung between two pines, evenings watching fireflies light up the shoreline. Occasionally I would glance at the spot where Karen had first set foot and remember the adrenaline rush of plotting a tug, the swirling faces of confused partygoers, and the sheer exhilaration of setting a plan in motion. But those memories were softened by time and distance. They were a reminder of the lengths one must go to defend personal space and community norms. They were also a testament to ingenuity over brute force. 1 week later, I received an unexpected gift in the mail, a framed photograph taken by Todd's drone. It captured the dock mid-tow, cutting a perfect diagonal across the blue lake, with Karen at the far edge clutching her megaphone. Below the image was a small plaque that read to the owner who towed with dignity. I hung it on the wall of my lakeside garage and smiled every time I passed it. The picture was a snapshot of the outrageous ridiculousness that had united the community in laughter and solidarity. It was proof that standing up for one's rights can be delivered with a wink rather than malice. And so the dock stood, proud and resolute, a silent sentinel at the water's edge. It bore the scars of conflict, scratched rails, a replaced plank here and there, but those marks were badges of a story worth telling. This was more than a structure of wood and steel. It was a symbol of home, effort, and the unwavering conviction that a boundary respected is a boundary preserved. As I walked away that night, the lake reflected 1,000 twinkling stars, and I whispered a promise to protect this sanctuary for years to come. After all, a peaceful dock is a happy dock, and on this lake, peace had never felt so well earned.